Alright, is it good?
Yep, we're good.
Right. Who can tell me what a population is? What's the definition? Yes.
A population is a group of organisms of the same species that live in a specific area.
Exactly. That was a perfect definition. It's a group of organisms of the same species that live in the same geographic area. Is this class a population? Yeah? Why? Okay, so is the high school population? Okay, so basically what you're telling me is we could define the size of the geographic area. Now, in nature, that sometimes isn't as easily done. Like, the population might be cut off by a mountain range or something, and they wouldn't be able to get to the other population. So we wouldn't be able to consider that one whole population because there are geographic barriers in between them. So they would be two populations. Alright? But it really depends on how we define the geographic area, right? To talk about how big the population is. Now, population ecology is the study of population dynamics, so how populations change over time and how they interact with the environment, with abiotic and biotic factors. Exponential growth. Now, populations will grow exponentially if there are no restraints. If there's unlimited resources and they're all in ideal conditions. Do we find this very often in nature? Ideal conditions like that with no constraints? Not really, but we could simulate it in the lab, right? I see a lot of head nods and shakes, right? Okay, can we simulate this in the lab? How can we do that?
In a petri dish with the bacteria, you can simulate it, but unfortunately the bacteria are limited by space.
Exactly. What she was talking about is if we had bacteria, we could have a petri dish on nutrient agar, and the bacteria will grow at an exponential rate until they start running out of space or resources. But if we give them unlimited resources, they're going to keep growing until they run out of space. Okay? Predation and competition, these are all constraints on exponential growth. So we won't see exponential growth if one of those things exists, or both. Okay? Carrying capacity is the limit of exponential growth. Obviously, in nature, there isn't unlimited resources. There's a limit to all kinds of growth. Right? Carrying capacity is the amount of organisms that an ecosystem can support. And these are due to density-dependent factors. Does anybody know what a limiting factor is? Other than Anna? It's a limiting factor. Yeah. Okay. Can anybody elaborate on that a little bit? Besides Anna? Alright, go ahead.
A limiting factor is a specific idea of the climate or the food that limits the population from growing, because say like a lack of space, the limiting factor,
Okay.
Food, water.
Okay, so it's the resource that's like hard to come by, but is necessary for them to survive. A limiting factor for, say, a pond. Usually their limiting factor for algae growth, is nitrogen. I don't know if you know this, but fertilizers, artificial fertilizers that we apply to crops and things like that, their main component is nitrogen. And a lot of it gets run with the water cycle. There's a lot of runoff, and the nitrogen usually makes it into waterways, like ponds and things like that. Then the algae grows out of control, because nitrogen was its limiting factor. So with the excess amount of nitrogen that the fertilizer inputs into that pond, it makes growth of algae grow at an exponential rate. Does that make sense? Questions about that? Okay. So these are all density-dependent factors, our limiting factors and carrying capacity and things like that. They're resources that are limited. Any sort of resource that was available to them, if it's limited, and can only be used by a certain amount, or a certain size of a population, those are all density-dependent factors. And then the flip side to this is density-independent factors. These are basically factors that affect all populations in a similar way, regardless of their size. If there's a volcano eruption and wipes out half of Hawaii, it doesn't matter how many birds were on that island. They're all going to be wiped out the same amount, right? They're all going to be killed in the same way. To give you some examples, natural disasters and human activities, like putting a dam on a river. If we dam off a river that inhibits the water flow, it's going to affect all of the organisms in the river the same way. It doesn't matter how many fish were in that river, they're all going to be impacted. That make sense? I'll give you a second. Okay. So let's talk about some examples here. Would drought be a dependent or independent factor? Independent? Why?
Because it will affect all of the plants regardless. It's not enough water.
Right. Natural disasters like drought and things like that, that's an independent factor. If there's no water available, it doesn't matter how many people are in that population, none of them are going to get any water. However, if there's a limited amount of water, water is a density-dependent factor, the availability of water. But a drought, per se, that natural disaster, that's an independent factor, okay? What about disease? This is a tricky one.
To me, it's independent.
Thank you. Why do you say that?
Because disease, like, it depends on type of disease, but when I think of disease, I think of like an epidemic, and an epidemic will affect all people no matter what. But it also
Okay, wait, alright, let me let somebody else answer. Go ahead. Is disease independent or dependent?
I think it's dependent.
Why?
Because it affects people in different ways. Their immune system can keep up with the disease or not.
Alright, why don't I add an example in here? What about the flu? Would the flu be independent or dependent?
it will be independent.
Well, let somebody else, let's raise their hands. Yes. I'm sorry, did you say it was what? Dependent? Why?
Because they can take care of themselves.
Okay, so they could like hide from people. What she's getting at is that it's a communicable disease. Okay, this is spread from person to person. Flu is spread from person to person. So if I'm closer to a population that has the flu, the chances of me getting the flu are greater. If I sealed off this room and one of us is coughing, okay, and none of us can get out, the chances of you getting that cough are greater because that is transmitted person to person. Okay, does that make sense? However, what about cancer? Would cancer be an independent or dependent? Anybody? Chad. How do you get cancer? Okay, if I cough on you, are you going to get cancer? Okay, but this is we're talking about population dynamics, though. So if it's dependent or independent, so does it depend on how closely packed together we are for the transmission of cancer? No? Okay, exactly. So it's independent, right? It doesn't matter how close together we are. It doesn't matter how dense of a population we are. If somebody has cancer, they have cancer. It's not a communicable disease. So when we say disease up on the board here, we're talking about communicable diseases, which means something that's transmitted person to person. Okay? Yes?
So communicable diseases are all dependent variables?
Dependent, yes.
Okay, that's what
Exactly. Alright, what about predation? What about predation, guys? Is that independent or dependent? Does that depend on the size of a population? Alright, good.
It is dependent because predation can only occur if there's a large population. If there's like a smaller population, it will affect the rate of predation, and predation will also directly affect the population size of the prey.
Okay, if I was a lion, alright, what would I go after? Would I go after a herd of antelope or just one antelope? Which one would I have more of a more likelihood of catching something? If I chased a herd of antelope or just one? Right, we're playing the numbers game. My chances of catching something are much greater if there's a bunch of them around me.
Well, isn't that where you're gonna like French you off?
No. Okay. All right. That being aside, I'm talking about a numbers game. Okay. Am I more likely to catch something if they're all right? Let's talk about fish, because they're not gonna fight me. All right. Would I be more likely to catch a fish if there were a lot of fish or just one fish? Okay. All right. Now, on the flip side of that, if I were the prey, okay, would I want to be in a herd or by myself? Why? Yeah, the chances of me getting caught are much less if I'm in a huge group. I'll probably trip you, alright? To get away. No offense, but I'll probably trip you. Alright, we're being chased by something. I'm sorry. Okay, but my chances of being caught are much less if that's why birds fly in such large flocks. Because the chances of that individual being caught are much less if they're flying around with a bajillion other friends. Okay? Probably want to be on the inside of that. Just saying. Alright. What about nesting space? Is that independent or dependent? Nesting space. Nesting space. What's nesting space? Independent or dependent? Yeah, again.
I think it's dependent because how large your area is, it depends how much space you have to yourself.
Exactly. There's only so many trees, okay? There's only so many trees in a certain area. If you think about it with like bald eagles really like the tallest trees in the area to nest on top of. If those trees are not available for nesting space, if they're chopped down or if they're in small supply, then there's not going to be as many nests. What about hurricanes? This is an easy one. Come on. Hurricanes, density, independent or dependent? Say again? Why?
It's a natural disaster.
Exactly. It's a natural disaster, so it's going to be independent. If a hurricane hits the coast, again, doesn't matter how many houses are on the coast, they're all going to be affected in a similar way, okay? It's not a density dependent. It doesn't matter how many birds are on that beach. They're all going to be washed away. Alright? What about parasites? Yes?
I had a question about the hurricane.
Oh, yeah.
Would it be possible to say that the hurricane is semi-dependent because of like rising human population and climate change?
It's difficult to talk about this in terms of humans because we're special and we take care of ourselves a lot in a different way than most nature does. So think about it with animal populations. It'll be a lot easier to understand. Yes?
Hurricane also, like, it hits the whole city, right? Like, the whole city population. It might only affect a small portion of the city and not the rest of it. You say, like...
Okay, but that depends on where you are located in that city. So it didn't matter how many people were in the city. It just mattered where you were in the city, right?
Oh, so that's what
Okay. So that's still density independent because it doesn't matter how closely packed that population is. It just matters where you were. Okay? Yeah. Oh, wait, hold on. Okay, parasites. Is that independent or dependent? Parasites. Well, think about it this way. How do parasites get transmitted? Typically. Parasites. Kennedy. Well, parasites usually get transmitted from host to host. Now, unless they have this crazy life cycle, which some parasites do, where they go to like a different species. If it's a parasite that gets transmitted from, say, person to person, is that a density dependent or independent factor? Dependent. Why do you say that, Michael Tom? Exactly. Parasite's going to be more easily transmitted from person to person if we're closer together. Same thing with communicable diseases. Okay? Alright, what about clearing forest? We do that a lot. Clearing forest. Somebody who hasn't given me an answer yet. What about clearing forest?
It wouldn't matter how many birds were living in the forest, they both be wiped out their habitats.
Exactly. Independent. Did everybody hear her? Yeah? Yeah? No? No? She said that it'd be independent because it doesn't matter how many animals are living in the forest. If we clear the entire forest, none of them are going to have a place to live. Okay, moving on. So what I was talking about before were carrying capacity, limits to growth. So if you look over here, this is the exponential growth curve. On the x-axis here, we have time. And as time goes on, the population size increases at an exponential rate. This means that at each time interval, the population usually doubles or triples in size. Okay? And if you look over here, this dotted line, it's usually labeled K for carrying capacity. We label it with a K, not a C. I don't know why. Alright. This dotted line symbolizes carrying capacity. And as the exponential growth increases, okay, so as the amount of the population increases, it starts getting closer and closer to that limit. The limit amount of organisms that ecosystem can sustain. Alright? The resources are then becoming more scarce, harder to find. It's taking more energy for them to find the resources. So the rate of population growth starts to decrease as you get around carrying capacity. Who here knows what like an asymptote means? Or an asymptote, depending on how you pronounce it. Good.
It's like never touches the X.
Okay. It basically means that this curve is going to level off. Alright? It's going to level off. We can't live above our carrying capacity. We can't be a larger population than the ecosystem can allow. Okay? So we have a little limited number of resources. There can only be so many of us that can survive on that amount of resources in order for the resources to replenish itself and so on. Okay? So this rate has to slow down. Sometimes the population will overshoot carrying capacity, okay? Sometimes it's just like by a little bit, and then it starts to oscillate around carrying capacity and levels off. Sometimes it's called boom and bust, okay? Boom and bust is when it overshoots carrying capacity and then goes down, because it goes too far over carrying capacity. So there's no more resources available for those organisms to survive on, and then it starts to decline a lot. Okay? So we call that boom and bust when it overshoots carrying capacity. Okay? Alright. Predator-prey dynamics also show boom and bust cycles. Okay? Boom and bust cycle is when it increases and decreases, and it keeps oscillating. Okay? If you look at the hair starts increasing and then decreasing. And it just keeps going on. All throughout time. That is normal. That's typical of a regular ecosystem. Yeah? Oscillating means it goes up and down, like a roller coaster. Kind of. Okay? If you look at the hair population starts increasing around, we'll say that's like 1846. Okay? And then the lynx population starts to increase around like 1850, so a couple years later. Does anybody have any idea why that would happen?
Because when the hare's population increases, the other animal will eat that, so their population will die.
Exactly. Did everybody hear what she said? The hare population is increasing, which means that the resources, the food item for the lynx is also increasing. Okay? But it's at a delayed reaction. It's in effect too. Okay? If the hare population increases, the amount of resources for the lynx to increase is available. Alright? And then the lynx will start reproducing more. So then there'll be more lynxes. Okay, lynx? I think just lynx. Alright. Lynx eye. Alright, cool.
I think it's just a lynx.
That's irrelevant. Anyway, so it's in effect of, if the resources start to increase, it'll be able to sustain a larger predator population. We call that a predator-prey lag. Alright? The predator increases, but at a lag to the prey. Okay? Any questions about this? Does this make sense? And then the boom and bust cycle is just, going back to that just real quick, it's because it's going up and down over and over again. We call them boom and bust cycles. But again, some populations just overshoot their carrying capacity and bust. Okay? So it doesn't have to be oscillating like this. It can just be up and down. Alright? Moving on. And this kind of goes into survivorship curves. Okay? Survivorship curves are how much of the population survives to a certain age. Now if you look, the x-axis is now different. The x-axis is age now, okay, as opposed to time. And then this is the how much of the population is surviving. Excuse me, sorry. Okay. Let's start with type 3. Type 3 population, as you see, it starts at like 100%. We'll talk about this in terms of percentages, okay? 100% is surviving to start with. Then, not even like probably like a fourth of their life through, a fourth of their lifespan through, most of the